All right, welcome back to part two of week three, obtaining permissions. So, talking about public domain, and I want to start here to talk about fair use. So, fair use is something you've probably heard of before. It's a provision in US copyright law that allows for the use of copyrighted content for specific purposes, such as education and research. So sometimes organizations, especially like the ones that we all work for, make the assumption that since education and research are part of the organizational mission, that anything we do counts as fair use. But fair use is actually a lot fuzzier than that. It's more of a spectrum or a scale. There are various factors that can tip the balance towards or away from fair use of in copyright materials. If you're making full versions of in copyright materials available online for commercial purposes, like selling reproductions, that's a set of factors that would tilt the balance away from fair use. Um, a really handy tool to help you think through all of this is the Fair Use Evaluator from the Copyright Advisory Network of the American Library Association, which is another resource that's included in the toolkit and in your readings for this week. Um, and it also has some really great like informational pop-ups that explain what it's asking about and why. So I highly recommend checking that out. Another thing to consider is the use of online digital materials versus on-site digital materials. So remember, libraries and archives have the right to preserve materials regardless of their copyright status. The provision of the US Copyright Code, which is Section 108, is how it's referred to. The provision explicitly allows libraries and archives to make up to 3 copies of a work for preservation purposes. The items being preserved can be in any format: text, images, sound, etc. Furthermore, those copies can be digital as long as they are not distributed digitally or made available to the public in a digital format outside of the premises of the library or archives. In other words, you always have the right to digitize an in copyright work as long as you're not making it available online or outside your library or archives without the permission of the copyright holder. That's all assuming that you haven't decided to use fair use, that the work is in copyright, that you have determined that you don't have the permission of the copyright holder. There are a lot of ways to get digital materials online and available for the public to view without having to just keep it at your site physically. Let's talk about risk management a little bit because this will explain a little bit of what I'm talking about. There can be financial risks, reputation risks, um, and the risk of maybe wasted work for libraries, archives, and museums around copyright issues, but these are pretty rare. So we hear these horror stories of like Disney or movie studios coming after, organizations for copyright violations. But I want to tell you that that is a very rare situation. When copyright situations come up, they're almost always resolved through discussion rather than litigation. So I'm not saying I can't say don't worry about it. I'm just saying that there are many steps you can take to reduce the potential for risk, and that if issues do come up, they can be worked through. So, for instance, let's say you've made the decision to put an orphan photo online, something that you can't determine the copyright status of. You know that based on the date it's in copyright, but you don't know who the photographer is or anything else about it. What could happen? If the copyright holder for that photo finds it online, they can send you what's known as a takedown request or a copyright infringement notice. This is very rare and it's not as scary as it might sound. If you do hear from a copyright holder with a valid request to remove the item, your best course of action is just to take it down. If you ignore the request or you say no, that's what opens the door to potential legal action. And that's where the risk of wasted work could happen. Could you digitize an entire collection of photos from somebody that you can't get a hold of, and you're like, well, I'm just going to digitize these and put them online anyways? Potentially, you could have wasted the work if you find out later that you need to take them down. That's why we're talking about this during the planning phase so that you can be aware of all this while you're choosing what materials to digitize and how to share them. If your organization or institution chooses to make orphan works available online, there are a couple of practices you can adopt to minimize that risk. Really, these are good practices to adopt for any materials you put online, and they're all basically about being transparent about your decisions. The big one is, of course, to clearly indicate the copyright status of any items that you put online. And there's a great resource called rightsstatements.org, which has a set of standardized language statements you can use for this. Other best practices include making sure to attribute the creator or copyright holder whenever that is known, and adding some language to your website or online collection to describe what you'll do if you do receive a copyright infringement notice. If you Google takedown policy, you'll find all kinds of examples of this from other libraries and archives, and there's some examples in the Digital Readiness Toolkit as well. So that's all the legal information. I would argue that the ethical side of this permissions gathering process is even more important than the legal side. The legal, the laws and regulations and sections of the US Copyright Code, those at least are pretty straightforward, even if it's confusing to navigate, but you can get to an answer. There are other considerations than copyright that you should be factoring into your decisions to share materials online. Again, this could be an entire course all on its own, but I'm sharing this list here as food for thought. Regardless of copyright status, some red flags to be aware of are materials that contain any personally identifiable information, materials that might violate a community's cultural protocols, or materials that violate an individual's right to privacy, particularly for protected or vulnerable populations. And of course, the question is going to arise, what if I do have some of these materials? There are some options available, but first and foremost, if you can at all consult with the people or communities depicted, or who might have an interest in the digitization project, you should do that first. If you don't already have a relationship with those communities, this is a really good opportunity to start building one, not for transactional purposes of can you please give me permission to share this thing, but to get to know folks and find out um, what their interest is in these materials, in their history, in the way that they're depicted in the historical record. Some options you do have, just pretty practically on a practical level, you could make items available only on site, which lets you control access a little bit more and control what's done with the images. You could blur the items online until it's clicked or blur it entirely, still providing that descriptive information, but requiring a user to request an unblurred version. I've come across this before with old yearbooks where it's important to preserve the history that is depicted in the yearbooks, but there are offensive images or potentially offensive images. And then they're just blurred. And if somebody wants to see the original item, they either have to request it or view it on site. You could decide not to digitize it, but still provide the metadata for such an item for online searching and finding, and then tell folks they have to come in to see the physical item, not the digital item in person. In some cases, you might find that the community members depicted in the materials would not only like you to not digitize them, but they would like to take the materials back. And although this is a sensitive situation that needs to be addressed on a case by case basis, this is where I'm going to return to my advice that you or your institution do just that when requested. If this is the party that has the least amount of power in this situation, consider listening to that party for what they want to do with these materials. If we have materials that have depicted historical indigenous figures and the local tribal community would like those images returned, either physically or digitally, my first choice and my advice to you is always going to be to abide by the wishes of the community. Again, huge topic. This is not an easy situation to navigate, But for the purposes of this course, I want you to know that it's a real issue that librarians and archivists come up against when they are dealing with digitization projects. Okay, so a couple of last logistical things. There's a few things that appear in this chapter of the toolkit that, again, just like last week, I want to specify you don't need to do for the assignment, but can be helpful for you in your own digitization projects. The toolkit gives you a bunch of information and some samples of forms like deeds of gift and donation forms. These are super useful. You should feel free to use them in your own institution, but you don't need to write one for this project unless you want to. Um, you could consider, if you want to, and you don't need to tell me, but if you could think about it, how you would want to go about documenting permissions. You also don't need to write a full harmful content statement at this point for the assignment. Again, there's examples, but you just need to know where to find those in the future. For now, I would recommend that you just think about which materials might benefit from a harmful content statement. And that's it for this week. As always, keep in touch. Let me know how things are going. And thanks. I'll see you next week.